work like ours. And right up top, he told the French, now, if it's going to work for you, here's how it works for us, and the only way it's going to work for you is if you make sure you have the religion, if you teach religion in schools. You cannot have secular education and expect to have a nation that survives. You got to make sure that God's part of what. Now, this is a guy that we call the penman of the Constitution, and he's writing documents for other nations showing them that they got to keep faith as part of what they do. Alexander Hamilton, you recognize him. He was a general, the first Secretary of Treasury. He's the guy who started the Christian Constitutional Society to make sure that we elected to office people who supported Christianity and the Constitution. Those were his two objectives of that society. You have John Langdon. John Langdon, as governor of New Hampshire, he's one of the founders of the American Bible Society. You have Gunning Bedford, one of Washington's generals. Every time Gunning Bedford closed a speech, here's how he closed his public speech. I copied this line out of one of his speeches. This is what he did for all of them. He says, now to the triune God, the Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost, be ascribed all honor, dominion, forevermore. Amen. But who's ever heard of Gunning Bedford, signer of the Constitution, one of our generals? You have James Wilson, signed the Declaration and the Constitution, started the first school of law in America. I have his original law books. He said, students, you cannot have a good civil law if it violates God's divine laws. Anything that violates God's laws is not a good civil. That's why we always posted the Ten Commandments not in churches. We posted the Ten Commandments in government buildings because we wanted to make sure we didn't violate divine law. And, I could take you through the others, but let me take you even to the least religious, Ben Franklin. Because on Thursday, June the 28th, 1787, they were having trouble at the convention. They'd gone 5 weeks. They were fighting. They were arguing. They were bickering. They couldn't get along. It was at that point that Franklin, 81 years old, the old man of this convention, he gave the longest speech at the convention. And it was a speech to try to call them together in unity because everybody came with their own agenda. You had the New York plan. You had the New Jersey plan. You had the Connecticut plan. You had the Virginia plan. Everybody had a plan, but they weren't coming together. New York's already had it. The delegation's going home in disgust. They're tired of fighting. Virginia's had it. They're going home. So at that point, he arises and he gives this speech. He's talking to George Washington, the president of the convention. Under parliamentary procedure, you don't talk to the delegates, you talk to the leader of the convention. And this is what he said. He said, Mr. President, the small progress we have made after 4 or 5 weeks' close attendance and continual reasonings with each other, he says, our different sentiments on almost every question is, methinks, a melancholy proof of the imperfection of human understanding. We have just spent the last 5 weeks showing the limitations on human wisdom. He said, we've gone and we can't agree on anything. He says, we indeed seem to feel our own want of political wisdom since we've been running about in search of it. We've gone back to ancient history for models of government and examined those different forms of republics which now no longer exist. We looked at Greece and Sparta and Rome. Doesn't work for us. He says, we've viewed modern states all around Europe but find none of their constitutions suitable to our circumstances. We looked all across Europe, but that didn't work either. He says, in this situation of this assembly, groping as it were in the dark to find political truth and scarce able to distinguish it when presented to us, how has it happened, sir, that we have not hitherto once thought of humbly applying to the Father of lights to illuminate our understanding? He said, in the beginning of the contest with Great Britain, when we were sensible of danger, we had daily prayer in this room for divine protection. This is where they signed the Declaration. That's where they had chaplains and prayer all throughout. He said, we had daily prayer in this room for divine protection. Our prayers, sir, were heard, and they were graciously answered. He said, all of us engaged in the struggle must have observed frequent instances of superintending providence in our favor. And have we now forgotten this powerful friend? Or do we imagine we no longer need his assistance? He said, I have lived, sir, a long time, and the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men. He says, if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid? He said, we've been assured in the sacred writings that except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. He said, I firmly believe this, and I also believe that without his concurring aid, we shall succeed in this political building no better than the builders of Babel. He says, I therefore beg leave to move that henceforth prayers imploring the assistance of heaven and its blessings on our deliberation be held in this assembly every morning before we proceed to business. Now, may I point out, that's not bad for your least religious founding father. He has just gone through and he's chewed the other guys out for not praying, and he's quoted to them out of Genesis, out of Psalms 127. He quoted to them out of Matthew 6. He quoted out of James 1. Quoted all these scriptures to show them they're not praying enough. George Washington records in his diary that at that point in time, they took 3 days off, and they went to church during that time. Oops, guys, lost the slides. If we can get the slides back up. They went to church in that time period. And they specifically, according to George Washington, went to the church of the Reverend William Rogers. William Rogers doctors had the convention, federal convention there in front of him, and he prays a special prayer. His prayer was actually a very long prayer. I have the original prayer. It was actually printed in the newspapers of that day on the front page so that everybody in the city would know the prayer that was just prayed over the Constitutional Convention. This is part of it. This is part of his prayer. He says, this is a period, O Lord, big with events, impenetrable by any human scrutiny. He said, we fervently recommend to thy fatherly notice that august body assembled in this city who compose our federal convention. Will it please thee, O thou eternal I am, to favor them from day to day with thy immediate presence? Enable them, he said, be thou their wisdom and their strength. Enable them to devise such measures as may prove happily instrumental for healing the divisions and promoting the good of the great whole. I mean, everybody knew they were fighting. Well, after this time of prayer, they came back, and the delegates said that the attitude was different. Jonathan Dayton said they started cooperating with each other and started thinking, that's not as dumb as I thought it was. Only 10 weeks later, we get the document in which we now govern. 10 weeks is all it took them to create that incredible document. Now, having finished that, what did they think about what they had just seen? It was all together. It was all falling apart. They go to church for 3 days and pray. They come back. 10 weeks they do it. What did they think about the document? Well, Ben Franklin, who called for prayer, this is what he said at the end of the convention. He says, I beg I may not be understood to infer that our General Convention was divinely inspired when it formed the new Constitution. He said, this wasn't the same as the prophets writing the scriptures. He said, I'm not saying this is equal to the Bible. He said, but I must own that I have so much faith in the general government of the world by providence that I can hardly conceive a transaction of such momentous importance should be suffered to pass without being influenced, guided, and governed by that omnipotent, omnipresent, beneficent ruler in whom all inferior spirits live, move, and have their being. He said, I'm not telling you this is exactly equivalent to the scriptures, but I'm telling you this is much a work of God as anything else that's ever been done in history. Nothing secular in his mind about what went on. Same thing with James Madison. James Madison in the Federalist Papers, this is what he told the nation. He says, the real wonders of the Constitutional Convention overcame so many difficulties. He said, and to overcome them with so much agreement was as unprecedented as it was unexpected. He said, it's impossible for the pious man not to recognize in it a finger of that almighty hand which was so frequently extended to us in the critical stages of the Revolution. Hey guys, God showed up again. He showed up in the Revolution. He showed up again in the writing of the Constitution. That's what James Madison tells the whole nation. And George Washington agreed. This is what the President of the Convention said. He said, as to my sentiments with respect to the new Constitution, it appears to me little short of a miracle. He says it demonstrates as visibly the finger of providence as any possible event in the course of human affairs can ever designate. If you've ever seen God show up, we just saw him show up at the Constitutional Convention. And Ben Brush, who I mentioned earlier, Benjamin Rush, this is what he said about it. He says, I do not believe the Constitution was the offspring of divine inspiration. Like Franklin, he's saying this is not the same as what was written by all the scriptures. And he says, but I'm as perfectly satisfied that it's as much the work of a divine providence as any of the miracles recorded in the Old and New Testament. Now here he goes through saying, there is no miracle in these scriptures bigger than what just happened in the Constitution. And somehow we're told today, oh no, this is a godless Constitution. Now, how can that possibly be? Well, if I take this book, this is the textbook that's used across the nation in our schools. It's written by 2 Cornell University professors. Here's their picture on the back. How do these 2 professors say that, all the founding fathers were atheists and agnostics and deists and none of them believed in... I mean, I've shown you a bunch of documents here. I've called specific, but we're teaching kids, no, it's all secular. On what basis do they say that? Let me show you the back of the book. You see up here on the screen, you see the slides here. You go to the back of the book to look at footnotes. Now, when you go to the back of this book and look at footnotes, there's a note on sources right there. You know what they say about the sources to prove the founding fathers were all atheist, agnostic, deists? They say, we've dispensed with the usual scholarly apparatus of footnotes. Really? Hey, we're PhDs. You can trust us. We know what we're talking about. Really? I mean, we get so many original, no, we're PhDs, and none of these guys believed in God. See, that is nothing but pure revisionism. And that's what we've had a steady dose of for the last several decades in our history. Now, American exceptionalism, this wasn't something that was just lightly understood. I mean, we understood that God was at the middle of American